This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 2.2 on the Republican era, which roughly leads us really from 1800 up through 1828 and the ascendancy of Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party. And what we want to look at here at the beginning is something that's actually going to become a trend in American history, and it actually will become a trend through American history that goes all the way into the 20th century, uh, and really still has some vestiges in the competition between the modern Democratic and Republican parties. Uh, the Federalists, for reasons that we talked about in the last slide, the Federalists will fall from grace. Okay, and it's largely two things that's going to lead to it. It's going to be a split within the party, first between Madison and Hamilton, and then Adams will join Madison's side. And it's also an alienation of their power base, largely after the direct tax of 1798. Well, what we're going to see is that this becomes a recurring theme. And the other part of the recurring theme is that, as we know, the Federalists stood for a strong national government. Okay, and we see the expansion of the authority of the national government and the sovereignty of the national government through the Federalist era, through Hamilton. I won't even call it the Washingtonian era. I'm going to call it the Hamiltonian era and the High Federalists. But at any rate, through the 1790s. Well, we're going to see what happens as a counterpoise to that is another political party, the Republicans, crystallizes and mobilizes based on pushing the idea of a limited national government. Okay? And we're going to see this repeatedly because what we're going to watch through the Republican era is a complete reversal of this. The Republicans win the election and unseat the Federalists based loosely on the idea that Thomas Jefferson and the Republican Party stand for a limited national government. But as time goes on, we're going to see that they expand the power of the national government to an unprecedented level, beyond even what the Federalists had imagined, which will alienate their base. There will be a split in the party, and then the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson will rise, and they'll make the same claim. They'll claim to be for limited national government, the power of the people, etc., etc., etc. They'll then get into power, and they then will expand the power of the national government. And we'll see this repeatedly throughout. The party that's out of power in each case will stand for limited national government because philosophically, I guess, in the nature of the American people, even really into modern times, is this idea of a limited national government, okay, of individual liberty. Well, what happens is each time one of these groups crystallizes into a party and comes into power, once in power, they begin to expand the national government. And it really gets to something. You've heard the phrase, I suppose, that power corrupts. And my favorite modification of that I read one time, which I think was very appropriate, is not that power corrupts, it's that power attracts the corruptible. Okay, and that, I think, is largely what happens here. Now let's watch it as it plays out. In the initial period when Jefferson takes over, okay, he reduces the power of the national government. This will be until about 1803 and the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so we'll see things like a reduction in the national debt and a reduction in government spending. So the debt will go from 83 million to 57 million. There will be an elimination of all internal taxes, most egregious of which was the internal tax of the direct tax of 1798, which placed the tax on land, dwellings, and property. Okay, was essentially the first property tax, and slaves. And so that will be eliminated. There will be a repeal of some of the Judiciary Acts. Now, between the Judiciary Act of 1789 and the Judiciary Act of 1801, which establishes judicial review, the Supreme Court of the United States becomes the dominant court, and the circuit court system of the federal courts, of the national courts, become the primary court, so that the national judiciary becomes Trump. Well, we're going to reverse that a little bit. Okay, we'll see a repeal of the Judiciary Act of 1801. We'll see the very famous case of Marbury versus Madison, in which, in the 11th hour, just before leaving office, Adams tries to get a last-minute appointment in there, and it's ruled that he can't do that because within the Constitution, he doesn't have, strictly speaking, that authority in the last minute. Okay, literally, it's a midnight appointment. It's at 11 o'clock at night. 1 hour before he leaves office, and they say you can't do that. That you need to abide by the process as set out in the Constitution, which takes some time for any presidential appointments. And ultimately what this gets to then is a kind of a reversal of the trend. What we've seen is a loosening of the definition of the Constitution. Well, this will call for a stricter interpretation. And one of the things that we're going to see is probably one of the defining features of the Republican era is a Supreme Court case that will come much later in 1819 at the end of the Republican era is going to completely reverse this. And so this will establish judicial review. Okay. In terms of international relations, the most famous thing probably that the Republicans do, at least in the early period, the Republican Party, the Republican era, we'll see the War of 1812, we'll deal with that in a minute, is the Louisiana Purchase. Now, this gives us an opportunity to establish the context of at least the first decade and a half of this Republican era, which only goes for about 2.5 decades. Okay, so the first decade and a half, what we have to remember is the context in which the United States finds itself is in the Napoleonic conflicts. The two major interlocutors by 1800 are Napoleon, France, and Great Britain. Okay, and they will both attempt to use the United States as a cat's paw against the other. They'll continually vie. We saw this in the 1790s. This began in the 1790s, and we talked a little bit about the phony war with Great Britain and the quasi-war with France, and ultimately the Anglo-American Accord. Jefferson, for his part, is much more leaning towards siding with France in an effort to solidify that kind of nation relationship, and in an effort to strengthen the Anglo-American or the Franco-American Accord of 1800 that was negotiated at the end of Adams. Napoleon is going to get rid of his North American possessions, selling them to the Jefferson administration, selling to the United States in the very famous Louisiana Purchase, which will give the United States control of everything west of the Mississippi from the Red River in Louisiana north, the Red River being the border now with Spain in the south, over west to the Rocky Mountains, okay, where Spanish possessions take over in California, and south of the Missouri River in the northern part, like what is modern day the Dakotas and Montana, which is considered the Oregon Territory. He'll sell it to them for 3.5 cents an acre. Now, we know that by policy, this now is going to expand. First of all, this is going to expand the United States by about doubling its territory, okay, which gives the United States government, the national government, a crap load more territory, which, as we saw before, they were selling for $1 an acre. Okay, this is roughly 3 million acres of land. So this is significant. This is going to be a significant amount of money that could come into the U.S. government as it sells this land off. Now, this is going to work out to haunt the United States government, which we'll get to later on in this lecture, with the purchase of with the private sector, okay, purchasing land westward. We'll deal with all that later. Now, it's with the Louisiana Purchase that we begin to see the shift in Jefferson's policy and in Jefferson's political philosophy. Jefferson is the leader, like, I mentioned briefly the idea of the Anti-Federalist Papers. These were penned largely by Jefferson. Jefferson was the leading author of these. Jefferson stood for limited national government and individual liberty. That was Thomas Jefferson's philosophical perspective. That was what, in fact, he won the election for in 1800. That was what unseated the Federalists, was that political point of view. we're now going to see the shift in Jefferson's attitude. And it's really kind of fascinating to watch between 1803 and 1808, how he changes his attitude. The first of them is going to be with the Louisiana Purchase. There is no congressional approval for the Louisiana Purchase. He does it through executive order. Okay? The purchase of the Louisiana Territory, technically speaking, could be defined as a treaty with France. It is an international negotiation. Therefore, it should have to have congressional approval. Jefferson will do it through imperial fiat. And furthermore, what he's going to do is he will, again through executive order, make it so that all Christian white people, Christian white males living in the Louisiana Territory are automatically U.S. citizens. Okay? Now that too is problematic. That requires congressional approval. That requires a revision of the emigration laws that already existed. So with one fell swoop, not only is Jefferson expanding the power of the national government, but he's expanding his own personal power and the power of the executive branch in the body of the president to an unprecedented level. Okay? Again, when we discuss British relations after the Franco-American Accord of 1800 are going to sour and go south very quickly. This will ultimately culminate in the War of 1812, which we'll get to by and by. And so I've already mentioned the context of the Napoleonic conflicts. Now, early on in the Napoleonic conflicts, both sides attempt to blockade the other. Now, obviously, Napoleon does not have the navy to try to blockade England. And so what he's going to reduce himself to, what Napoleon will end up reducing, what France will reduce itself to, is harassment of British shipping the world over. In fact, there's an absolutely excellent movie starring Russell Crowe that is set in this period that depicts this kind of thing called Master and Commander. And it's a brilliant Russell Crowe film. He plays a captain of a British vessel that is searching out a French privateer that is preying on English shipping in the Atlantic Ocean over by South America. But this is the kind of thing. Well, the British, for their part, are kind of doing the same thing. What we want to remember here is through the 1790s and into the Jeffersonian era, into the Republican era, the United States is pressing a claim under international law for the protection of neutral shipping. Okay? The United States officially is neutral in the conflict. Under the international law of the time, and under international law currently, I should perhaps parenthetically add, under international law, a neutral power is permitted without interference to ship to all sides of the conflict. So under international law, the United States presses its claim that it's allowed to ship both to Britain and to France. France has kind of settled this dispute a little bit with the Franco-American Accord, okay, and compensation of the Americans for the ships that were taken in that quasi-war period at the end of the 1790s. So things have settled down with that a little bit. The British, for their part, increase because as Jefferson moves in and as Jeffersonian policy takes over, remember the Federalists, one of the divisions in the party was between those who sided with England, namely Hamilton, and those who really moved more in the direction of siding with France, like John Adams. Same thing's going to be happening here. And so the British are going to begin a practice of intercepting American ships bound for France. Okay? A violation of international law, according to the Americans. And I guess technically speaking, it would be. You could, I mean, we're not international lawyers here, but at any rate, okay. Well, in a very famous incident in 1807, which will become one of the rallying cries of the War of 1812, the Chesapeake, an American ship, is seized by the British, okay, and it is a common practice for what the British do is they seize the American ship, they seize the cargo, they sell the ship back as a ransom, and impress the American sailors into service in the British fleet. Okay, the British fleet being constantly expanding and needing more men. And so the Americans raise an outcry over this. Secondly, and this is going to become another backdrop to the War of 1812, the Americans at this point really begin to press for control over all of North America. And so they will begin to press claims to British-controlled Canada. Okay, particularly in the east, but really all the way across, but particularly in the east, in the Ontario area. Okay, from roughly Kingston, Ontario, up through Quebec City along the St. Lawrence. In advancement of this overall position, the Americans will begin Jefferson will begin a bizarre trade policy, most notably and most controversial of which is the Embargo Act. Now let's recap the context we've just put this in. Okay, Britain principally, but France is engaging in it a little bit too, are intercepting American ships. Jefferson, in almost an act of desperation, gets tired of American shipping constantly being preyed on. And so he announces the Embargo Act. Henceforth, American ships will not leave port. Okay? And no foreign ships will enter American ports. The United States closes itself off entirely to trade. Now, we've already talked about this. The southern states, okay, depend on international trade. They depend on exports. So we want to take a look at this because, and we want to think of the political power bases. The Federalist Party's power base was in New England. New England is the one that is trying to develop a manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector served as the basis of the Federalist Party. This act furthers the cause of the manufacturers in the United States beyond any other single act in American history to this point. Okay? At the expense of the South, and the South is where Jefferson's power base was. So in one fell swoop, he cuts the throat of his power base. This is going to begin the real era of American protectionism, because the tariffs that they passed, like the tariff of 1789, was a 5% tariff. That is not enough of a tariff to cultivate your that's not enough to protect American manufacturing. 5%. Okay, the British were producing it much more cheaply than the Americans. Okay, so a 5% tariff on British goods or on foreign imports is not enough to protect American manufacturing. Blocking them entirely from coming into the United States, that's enough to protect American manufacturing. Okay? There is now no competition. There is no other manufactured products to be brought into the United States other than in New England. And what we'll see is a precipitous rise in manufacturing in New England. Well, at the same time that happens, the southern states no longer have a foreign market for their goods. So as a result, demand for southern products collapses, because now demand for southern products, principally at this point cotton, the only demand for it is going to be from the manufacturing interests in the United States. And so the manufacturing interests in the United States become, in a certain sense, monopsonistic. They become the only buyer, and therefore they can set prices. Okay? Demand for southern cotton collapses, and when the demand collapses, the price of cotton begins to drop. At the same time, because the manufacturers in the Northeast don't face any competition, their prices rise. And so the southern states now begin to accumulate a larger debt. Their terms of trade become progressively worse. The political backlash of this almost costs the Republicans the White House. The problem is there's no real alternative to the Republican Party. The Federalists, they've already cut their throat. That party division that happened at the end of the 1790s, it hasn't healed itself. Okay? And so the Republican Party almost cuts its throat through doing this. The only way it wins is that Jefferson promises that he won't stand for the presidency again. Okay? This collapses Jefferson's president. Remember, the phenomenon of U.S. presidents being limited to 2 terms comes after Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1940s. So we're long before that point. So Jefferson could have run for another office, but principally because of the Embargo Act, more than any other single act, he's cut his throat politically. Okay? The Republican power base in the South sees Jefferson as betraying their cause. Not to mention he's expanded the national government in a number of other ways, most importantly the Louisiana Purchase. And so they're willing to stay on board with the Republican Party because the only alternative to the Republican Party is the Federalists, okay, who are no friend to the Southerners either. As we saw through the Federalist era, they passed multiple legislations that were against Southern interests. So the Southerners really don't have any place to turn, okay? And so instead, they'll turn to an alternative Republican president, and Jefferson handpicks the perfect candidate, James Madison. Now let's remember, James Madison is the author of the Bill of Rights. James Madison was originally a Federalist who split with Hamilton principally over the National Bank in 1791. He then sided with Adams. So Madison has a certain appeal to the lower Federalists, to the non-Hamiltonian Federalists, and he has an appeal to the Republicans because he wrote the Bill of Rights guaranteeing individual liberty. So he appeals to both sides. He's a really well-picked candidate. He'll come into office after the election of 1808 and immediately get rid of the Embargo Act and instead put in the Non-Intercourse Act. Okay? The Embargo Act called for no U.S. ships to leave port and no ships coming into port, so there was no trade whatsoever. The Non-Intercourse Act will attempt to have American shipping avoid the kind of game that's been being played for better than 20 years now with American shipping between France and Britain. He'll institute the Non-Intercourse Act, okay, which is kind of a middle ground. U.S. ships will be allowed to leave port. Ships will be allowed to come into U.S. ports. We just won't trade with Britain and France, who are the 2 interlocutors now in the Napoleonic conflict in 1809. They're the last 2 standing. Russia being neutralized. We won't get into this. Isn't a class on European history, although it could be. But at any rate, okay. Continuing on with trade policy, while the Non-Intercourse Act is more politically popular than the Embargo Act, which was just suicidal, it still doesn't really help out Southern interests. And remember, the South is the Republican base at this point. And so Congress will pass Macon's Bill number 2. Okay. Now, this is a fairly technical point that Macon's Bill 2 will stress. The basic idea of Macon's Bill 2 is for reciprocation. If either the United Kingdom, either Britain or France, respect the right of the United States shipping interests, okay, and the other one does not, the United States will maintain the embargo against the one that doesn't. Whoever doesn't recognize the right of U.S. neutral shipping, the United States will maintain an embargo against them. Okay? Britain will reciprocate right away. and say and claim at least that they're going to respect U.S. shipping, although there are going to be a number of incidents from 1810 to 1812 of interception of U.S. ships. France, for its part, will not. At this point, the French are tired of the Americans trying to play Britain and France off of each other. The Napoleonic conflicts are becoming, by 1810, relatively desperate for Napoleon, which is ultimately going to lead to his invasion of Russia. Because by 1810, the Russians, while officially neutral in the war, are going to be supplying England more and more, and are going to be providing England with markets for their goods. And so they're really moving in the direction of war with Napoleon. And so Napoleon's position is becoming increasingly desperate in Europe. And he's tired of this sideshow with the United States. And so he desperately now needs to obstruct British shipping. And so he'll try to increase this precipitously. And one of the things is he won't respect this Makin's Bill number 2. Now, I mentioned this point with the Southern terms of trade before. We want to keep in mind what's going on here really from 1808 through really 1812, 1810 for these 2 or 3 years, and it's an ongoing problem. It's really begins in the 1790s, and it's an ongoing problem. It's going to continue all the way up to 1860 in the war between the states, especially with the Embargo Act. And remember what I said: the Embargo Act introduces the period of U.S. protectionism. From the beginning of that, and the Embargo Act is the most egregious of them, but we're going to see a number of others. As a result of the limitation of trade and protectionism is designed to do 2 things for the United States: raise government revenue through tariffs and protect American manufacturing interests, which means there's going to be a limitation of competition for American manufacturing interests, which means what happens economically, for those of us who remember micro or macro or even survey of economics, okay, competition has a tendency to push prices down. If you reduce the level of competition, there is a tendency for prices to ratchet up. So by imposing the Embargo Act and then later the Non-Intercourse Act and pursuing, roughly speaking, in general terms, this protectionist trade policy, you're reducing the amount of competition to the fledgling manufacturing sector in the Northeast, okay, in the northern states. And so as a result of this, prices for manufactured goods in the United States are going to go precipitously up. This is inflationary. Okay, which means that the Southerners who buy manufactured goods, all Americans who buy manufactured goods, but we're specifically thinking of the Southern states here, the Southerners who buy manufactured goods are going to have to pay more. That means more money out. If you'll recall, I said money flows in 2 directions. Money flows out, money flows in. This is money flowing out. So the Southerners, and in fact all Americans, are going to have to be paying more for manufactured goods. This is the price of protectionism. All right, they're going to have to be paying more for manufactured goods. Well, now in terms of the Southern states depend on exports, principally their main cash crop, which at this point is cotton. Okay, well, as a result of the protectionist trade policy, retaliatory tariffs are passed against the United States. And so the market for Southern cotton collapses. Demand for Southern cotton will drop. And so at the same time they're sending more money out because they're paying more for manufactured goods, the demand for their products has dropped, meaning and when the demand drops, the price of their products goes down, which means less money in. And so at the same time they're paying more for manufactured goods, more money out, they're receiving less money for the cotton, which means less money in. So they have more money going out and less money coming in, which is going to lead to a kind of a debt cycle in the South, which actually is going to continue uninterrupted until the war between the states. With Native relations now, let's again just kind of recap a little bit and look at this. We remember the Treaty of Greenville. okay, which follows Pontiac's rebellion. Remember the position the natives are in now. The natives exist in that nebulous no man's land between really the Appalachian Mountains, okay, and the Mississippi River. Well, in 1803, the United States purchases Louisiana Territory from France. And so there is no more no man's land. And in the north, the British, who under the Treaty of Paris ending the Revolution, part of the condition was that they would leave those forts in the north, everything south of the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes, okay, that would be ceded to the United States. They renege on that part of the agreement because the United States, they claim, has reneged on its part of the agreement by never repaying the war debt, okay, and by not compensating the Tories for the destruction of property during the Revolution. You remember that when we discussed the Treaty of Paris and the problems therewith. Well, as a result of that, the Indians in the Northwest, this is Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, were still able to play the United States off against the British. Now, understand the United States now has an objective to push all the way to the Mississippi River, and with the Louisiana Purchase then to push across the Mississippi River and spread across the continent. Well, directly in their way are the natives, are the Indians. Okay, in the Northwest, the Indians are able to align themselves with the British. This is going to lead to essentially what we refer to as the Pan-Indian movement and the Tecumseh War, okay, in the Northwest. Now remember what the Treaty of Greenville said. The Treaty of Greenville said that the United States agreed to end territorial expansion in the Northwest, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, to end without the agreement of the Indians. The underlying idea being that any further territorial expansion would largely be done through peaceful means. They would get the Indians to agree to it and buy it from them. That ain't going to happen, okay? Instead, in an effort to push the U.S. claim to this region, okay, and now this is kind of one of the subtle points that I just kind of want to get at a little bit here is, remember that under the Treaty of Paris, and this really gets to the overall attitude of the United States towards the natives. Under the Treaty of Paris, the agreement was that the British would withdraw from the Northwest, and that would leave the United States free in the Northwest to spread to the Mississippi River, roughly taking what is modern-day Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and the Great Lakes, the southern part of the Great Lakes region. Okay? Never mind the fact that in that region you have a thriving native population who might object to this. They're not even considered in the Peace of Paris. They're considered to be completely negligible and non-existent. They're not in part of the negotiations. They're discounted entirely. And so to press this claim, and obviously the United States isn't going to be able to push all the way to the Mississippi because the British are still there, but to press this claim, they're going to invade. The United States directly violates the Treaty of Greenville and invades native territory. And this will be all through the early part of the Republican era, and this will put an end to, the Tecumseh War especially, will put an end to what is in U.S. history referred to as the 60 Years' War. The 60 Years' War is a war between the United States and really originally the American colonists and the British and the Indian population, particularly of the Northwest, of the Great Lakes region. It ultimately is the conquest of the Great Lakes, the southern part of the Great Lakes region, by the United States. And the final death knell will be the Battle of Tippecanoe, in which William Henry Harrison, who will become a future president, in which William Henry Harrison makes his name. Okay, and so will John Tyler. John Tyler is his adjutant commander at Tippecanoe. which reminds me of a joke that maybe I'll get to it, when we deal with William Henry Harrison, because it's kind of a funny joke, although it takes a long time to get there. It's what we call a Gosnell joke. Gosnell was my English teacher when I was like in the 9th grade, and he told the joke, and I remember it from then. But at any rate, it's actually kind of funny. But at any rate, and now I'm distracted by it, but we'll move on. And with the defeat of Tecumseh at Tippecanoe, it ends the Indian problem in the Northwest for the United States. This gives the United States control over all of the territory in the Northwest up to the British position, which they're still holding on to. Okay? This leads us now to the War of 1812. Okay? And we want to look at this point towards the causes of the war. In the first part, we have what we were just talking about, native relations, the relationship between the United States and the native populations, and the British and the native populations. From the time of the Peace of Paris onwards, the native populations, particularly in the Northwest, were squeezed between the British and the Americans. The Americans, through force of arms that we just talked about, pushed the natives out. Okay, literally between a rock and a hard place. The English will side with the native populations in an effort to prevent the expansion of the United States up to the border of British territory. Okay, because of this intervention by the British, this is going to be one of the reasons that the United States is going to press for going to war in 1812. The second part of it, and it's related to this, is bold-faced U.S. expansionism. The U.S. believes that under the Treaty of Paris, that gives them carte blanche to expand into the Northwest region up to the Mississippi River. In addition, you have the Louisiana Purchase, which is now U.S. territory that needs to be controlled. And so ultimately they claim to be able to expand all the way through the Mississippi. In addition to this, you will have the U.S. pressing claims that all of North America needs to be unified. That right now, the British, who are in England, 3,000 miles away, control Canada. It is more of a natural extension for the United States to control Canada. They are, after all, geographically contiguous. And so it is more logical for Canada to be part of the United States than it is for it to be part of Britain. And so the United States will claim this, will press this claim. In addition, the kind of Embargo Act and Non-Intercourse Act and all of this international trade policy game that has been played for 20 years has just gotten too frustrating for the United States. Through a series of negotiations, and the British are again preying on U.S. shipping. Okay, this is happening. There are a number of international incidents despite the British reciprocation with the Makin's Bill. This is still continuing. Okay, and so in an absolute frustration, the United States has had it with all of these economic games that are being played. And then finally, probably the final excuse, and actually one of the lesser excuses, is the impressment of U.S. sailors. As I've said before, and as we saw in the Chesapeake incident, what's happening is the British are continuing to prey on U.S. shipping, and when they do so, they seize the cargo, seize the vessel, and impress the U.S. sailors into service in the British Navy. Okay? And so for all these reasons, the United States is now up in arms. The British, for their part, have their claims as well, most notably the continuing expansion of the United States into British territory, the United States continually moving in the direction of siding with France, the Louisiana Purchase, which we talked about. Okay, that was an indication of improving and solidifying U.S.-French relations. Okay, so the British see this as a violation of American neutrality in general, one of several. Okay, the U.S. still hasn't paid back the war debt to England. They still haven't compensated the loyalists. And so there are grievances on both sides here that are going to lead to this war, and tensions rise from really, I mean, they rise really from the moment of independence onwards, but they've really precipitously increased since the Non-Intercourse Act. And since Macon's bill in 1810, they've really precipitously increased 1812. Now, strategically for their part as well, the United States, okay, labors under a misapprehension, and we'll deal with it later. But the basic misapprehension, 1812, in June of 1812, Napoleon will invade France. This makes the Napoleonic conflicts a much more active war again. Really, from 1804 till 1812, there's not a lot that goes on. It's more of a chess match, a game of maneuver with Britain. Okay, both sides trying to bring each other to the needs economically. That's going to blow up in 1812, and it's going to become an active war again. The United States perceives then that Great Britain is going to be distracted in the Napoleonic conflicts. Their resources, the British resources, okay, will be devoted to combating Napoleon rather than defending their position in North America. So they see this as a position of British weakness. And so this is what's going to make the whole thing blow up, is the United States has been pressing these claims. Tensions have been increasing for the better part of 10 years. They're moving in the direction of war. They can't stand each other. They're getting ready for a fist fight. And then the United States perceives that Great Britain is going to be distracted by the Napoleonic conflicts. And so while the United States doesn't come out officially and back Napoleon, by action, de facto, they're going to be on the same team. They're going to have a coincidence of interest. Okay, so what the Americans perceive, in short, is while the British are distracted with Napoleon, the United States can launch an offensive, drive the British out of the Northwest, and seize British Canada. Okay, an ambitious plan. An ambitious plan. All these causes of the war were not, of course, universally accepted. And there was a considerable division over the war, and it divided largely on the basis of things that we've already talked about. The Federalist Party, the holdover of the Federalist Party, and their power base in New England, particularly the High Federalists who follow Hamilton, are in favor, are opposed to war with England. Okay, they actually lean towards supporting England against France. The other part of the Federalist Party, and particularly the Republican Party in the South, that kind of states' rights, limited national government power base, they're more leaning towards favoring France. And so you see the division over the declaration of war. And perhaps I should parenthetically add that the United States has only declared war 5 times in its history, and this is one of them. In fact, it's the first of them. It's the War of 1812. The others will be the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, and World Wars I and II. But this is the first of them. And you see, it gets by scarcely in favor of war, 79 to 49 in the House and 19 to 13 in the Senate, which is barely a majority vote in favor of the war. Under the Articles of Confederation, this would not have been sufficient to go to war. You needed a 2/3 majority under the Articles of Confederation to go to war. And clearly this isn't 2/3. And as I've said, the New England opposes the war. They show favoritism towards Britain. They benefited from the Non-Intercourse Act and from protectionism. The West and South wanted the war because of access to the Great Lakes, access to the Mississippi, driving the British once and for all from North America, particularly south of the St. Lawrence. And so, as we've talked about and highlighted a little bit, there are these divisions that are inherent within the United States, and they play out again here in in the lead up to the War of 1812, and we're gonna stop this one now. And move on with 2.2b, and 2.2b is going to cover the war itself and the post-war environment, and ultimately lead us to how the Republicans fall from power. So join me then in 2.2b, and I think it's probably going to go on to 2.2c as well.